They said I had no right. That I was selfish, sentimental, and not thinking clearly. But when I stood in front of that donation center, watching the last of my grandmother's heirlooms being loaded onto a cart marked community use, I felt more clarity than I ever had in my life. I'm Eleanor. 31. A former archivist turned antique restorer, raised in a family that prized image over integrity. My hands have catalogued centuries of history, yet nothing prepared me for the weight of what I carried that day, or for the silence that followed. Because no one in my family spoke to me for 3 weeks after that. Not a word. Not until my Uncle Martin's lawyer sent a letter trying to reverse the donation on behalf of the family. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about teacups or tapestries. This was war. My grandmother, June Whitmore, had been the quiet backbone of our lineage. She lived in the old house on Arden Road, the one with ivy overtaking the west wing and sunlight leaking through warped window panes. She didn't believe in updating things. She believed in preserving them. Like dignity. Or truth. She'd let me stay there after my divorce, no questions asked, just quiet warmth and the smell of lemon verbena on every linen. We'd sip tea under the arching magnolia in the backyard, talk about preservation work and the grotesque decisions my mother continued making. It was there, one May afternoon with bees hovering at the edge of her garden, that she first mentioned changing the will. It won't make me popular, she said. But I've seen how they behave. And you're the only one who never treated this place like a prize to win. I'd been stunned. Grateful, yes. But stunned. The formal inheritance came nearly a year later, after her stroke. The reading was curt. Terse. My mother clenched her jaw the entire time, my cousins whispered about mistakes, and my Aunt Linda cried, not for June, but for the estate she assumed she'd inherit. The house, the furnishings, the heirlooms, all of it was left to me. And I did what no one expected. I kept only what I needed. What she would have wanted me to keep. A few things with stories stitched deep into their fabrics. And the rest? I gave it all away. To the local history museum, the women's shelter, the preservation society she adored. I documented every item. I photographed, logged, and wrote provenance notes. I didn't rush it. It took months. But I made sure it was done right. And then, I vanished from their radar. Until this morning. The letter was folded neatly. It came with a thin smile of a postscript from Martin's lawyer. Our clients are pursuing every legal avenue to recover what was lost. Lost. As if they'd ever cherished any of it. As if they hadn't treated June's home like a glorified antique mall. As if they hadn't sold off parts of our history, quietly, over the years, to fund vacations and emergency home improvements. I sat in the back of my car after reading the letter. Engine off. Rain tapping gently on the windshield. My hands didn't shake. My breath was even. I wasn't afraid. Because for once, I had done what was right, not what was expected. And they couldn't undo that. But I also knew this wouldn't end with threats. They wanted something more. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it moves softly. Like moths in linen closets, eating holes through the illusion of legacy. That evening, I opened the antique trunk in my apartment, the one lined with old family correspondences, the real records, the unsanitized stories June had kept hidden. She'd called it her counter-archive. And tucked among the brittle pages was a sealed envelope. On it, in her looping script, in case they come for you. I broke the seal. Inside was a notarized letter and 2 photographs, one dated 1978, the other, more recent. Neither made sense at first. Then I saw it. The handwriting. The signature. And suddenly, it wasn't just heirlooms they'd tried to take. It was her story. Her truth. And now it was mine to protect. I turned on the lamp beside me. My hands were steady as I picked up the first pen. Because I knew exactly what I had to do next. Under the amber glow of that desk lamp, I held June's words like a lifeline. For the first time since she passed, I felt her presence in the room with me, not as memory, but as intention. She hadn't just left me a house. She left me her unfinished resistance. My breath caught as I looked at the photographs again. In one, a man with tired eyes and a crooked tie stood beside a display case filled with familiar items, a silver hand mirror, the inlaid cane, the tapestry purse June always kept on the hall chair. The caption read, "Private Collection, Whitmore Provenance." The second photo was more recent. A gala. White linen tablecloths. That same mirror, now under glass, labeled circa 1890, donor anonymous. But I recognized the bracelet lying beside it. It had never left the house. Until now. I picked up the notarized letter. June's voice echoed silently through the page. To whom it may concern, the contents of the Whitmore estate are not just artifacts, they are records of lived experience, of survival, and erasure. This documentation serves as legal and historical affirmation that all listed items were acquired through ethical, familial inheritance and not for sale or profit. She'd listed each item in her precise script. Even included notations about their use, given to me by Miriam Cohen, 1944, when she fled Vienna, or worn by my mother, Mabel, when she marched in 1920. This wasn't just documentation. It was evidence. It struck me that June must have known. That the moment she signed the will, there would be fallout. That they'd try to reclaim the story. Rewrite her. Reclaim me. I folded the papers slowly. Slid them back into their envelope. Not out of fear, out of reverence. There were names she hadn't spoken in years. I remembered one in particular, Miriam. June had only ever mentioned her once, in passing, as a woman who gave me courage when I had none. I never asked more. I should have. I stood and walked to the shelf above my desk. Pulled down the old registry book she'd used for cataloging. It was worn at the edges, wrapped in blue linen. She called it her quiet spine. Inside, tucked between pages of records and sketches, was a faded letter from Miriam herself. Dated 1947. Postmarked New York. In German, then translated in pencil beneath each line, were words that burned even after all this time. History is what survives the theft of memory. I closed the book and sat back down. My phone buzzed. A message from my cousin Lydia. They're serious. Martin's threatening litigation. Then, a second message, one that felt far heavier. I'm sorry. But I can't be involved. Don't contact me. I didn't respond. I'd always known Lydia didn't have the stomach for confrontation. She preferred neutrality, even in the face of injustice. It was a kind of quiet betrayal I'd grown used to, the soft, civil kind that leaves no scars but never heals either. What I hadn't expected was how little it hurt this time. Instead, I reached for the key to the storage unit I hadn't visited in years. It was time to go back. The drive out to Oak Ridge took just under an hour. The old facility still sat beside the abandoned railway line, its gravel lot pockmarked and overgrown. I parked under the half-dead maple tree and stepped out into the brittle late winter air. Inside, the dust smelled like thyme. I opened the unit and was greeted by rows of carefully packed boxes, my own belongings from my earlier life, before June's house, before the divorce, before silence became my preferred language. But in the back corner, wrapped in oilcloth, was what I came for. June's private files. She'd asked me to store them here 5 years ago, after a particularly hostile family Christmas when Uncle Martin accused her of weaponizing nostalgia. They'll never know they're gone, she had said, tucking them in the trunk like sacred texts. And one day, you'll need them. I brought the entire trunk back to my apartment that night. Over the next 3 days, I barely slept. I combed through every paper, photograph, letter, receipt. I logged everything. Cross-referenced donation records with inventory lists, museum registries, auction archives. What I discovered made me physically ill. Some of the heirlooms, the ones I'd donated in good faith, were being quietly appraised by third parties. The director of one local history foundation had already fielded inquiries from a private collector, one connected to my uncle's firm. They weren't trying to reclaim family history. They were trying to convert it into capital, into leverage. I sat on my couch that third night, knees pulled to my chest, feeling the weight of it all settle in my bones. Not the weight of betrayal, that had passed. This was something else. Resolve. I called only one person. Lena, an old friend from my museum days. Now head of acquisitions at the State Historical Society. She answered on the third ring. I need your help, I said. Quietly. Carefully. With what? A record. Before someone tries to erase it. She didn't ask questions. She just said, come by Monday. Bring everything. I slept that night for the first time in weeks. When Monday came, I dressed carefully. Neutrally. No trace of anything extravagant or sentimental. I packed the trunk in the back of my car and drove into the city. Lena met me in her office, its walls lined with climate-controlled cases and carefully labeled artifacts. She opened the trunk slowly, reverently, as if unearthing something sacred. This is more than a record, she said, fingers skimming June's original ledgers. I didn't reply. Just nodded. Lena began documenting immediately, photos, scans, signed intake forms. Everything legal. Everything traceable. I left that day with a digital backup, notarized, time-stamped. Irrefutable. When I returned home that evening, a voicemail waited for me. It was my mother. Her voice, always poised, now cracked just slightly at the edge. Eleanor. I think it's time we talked. I didn't delete it. Not yet. But I didn't call her back either. Instead, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. Because something had shifted. They thought I'd acted out of emotion, out of grief. They had no idea I was just getting started. The message came 2 days later, written in sharp, impatient sentences and signed with my mother's full name as if that might carry more weight. Your actions have caused considerable distress. We expect a formal retraction and immediate steps to recover the donated property. The family has retained counsel. I read it twice, then set it on the kitchen counter like something sour I didn't want near my hands. That morning, I'd made coffee without realizing my hands were shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the window, arms crossed, watching a pair of schoolchildren kick slush at each other on the corner. Their laughter reached me faintly through the glass, muffled by the kind of winter that always made time feel slower. Or heavier. I felt both. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lydia's husband, Evan. His tone was brisk, the text brief. Just giving you a heads up. They brought in Roswell and Klein. You'll want to be prepared. I stared at his message for a full minute before responding. I already am. He didn't reply. He never liked confrontation either. But at least he'd warned me. Roswell and Klein weren't just lawyers. They were family fixers, the kind you hired not for their compassion but for their capacity to erase. Property disputes, inheritance reassignments, retroactive guardianship filings, they'd made careers out of turning bloodlines into ledgers. And now they were coming for mine. By the end of the week, I'd received a certified envelope containing a formal request for arbitration. My donation of the heirlooms, they claimed, had violated implied familial agreements and demonstrated an intention to deprive multiple rightful heirs of ancestral property. The language was surgical. Legal. Detached. It used phrases like custodial mishandling and inappropriate disposal of legacy items. Not once did it use the word grief. I forwarded everything to Lena. She replied within minutes. Come in tomorrow. Bring originals. I'll walk you through our options. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor of June's old cedar trunk, surrounded by her hand-labeled folders and brittle manila envelopes. I reread her notes, letting my fingers trail the margins where she had written small reminders to herself, find photo of Mabel's brooch, or cross-check Miriam's letter with census archive. This was not mishandling. This was care. It was love made meticulous. I found myself whispering the names she'd written, one after another. Not like a spell. Not quite a prayer. Just so I wouldn't forget them. In the morning, I packed the materials carefully, dressing in soft, neutral tones, something Lena had once called armor by understatement. On the way to her office, I stopped at the florist down the block and bought a small bundle of juniper. I didn't know why, only that I needed something alive in the room with us. Lena greeted me with tea already steeping. She was like that, always knowing what a moment needed, even before I did. She gestured for me to sit, her expression unusually serious. She said, "They're banking on intimidation. Don't let it work." I answered, "It won't." She sifted through the arbitration request, marking passages with a red pencil, the way we used to when editing exhibition texts. Her annotations were sharp, but never angry. When she reached the part about disposal, she paused, jaw tightening. Then she said, "We can prove provenance. We can prove intention. And if it comes to it, public interest." She didn't need to explain. If they pushed too hard, we'd make it public. Everything. June's archive. The documented history of each heirloom. The notarized letters. The photographs. The donations, made transparently and with full records. Lena had connections in academic circles, museum boards, and historical journals. A whisper in the right ear, and this quiet inheritance war would become a feature story in every preservationist publication from here to D.C. But I didn't want spectacle. I wanted peace. Lena seemed to read my thoughts. She set her pencil down and looked at me closely. "You don't need to win their approval. Just protect her truth." I nodded once. That was all I ever wanted. The pressure didn't let up. Over the next week, the calls started, blocked numbers, unknown senders, all of them brief and cutting. Voicemails left in clipped tones. One from my mother. "You've embarrassed us. This isn't what June would have wanted." Another from my Uncle Martin. "If you don't reverse this, we will ensure no court views you as a stable custodian of family property again." The implication hung there, unspoken but obvious. They were threatening to challenge June's will next. Lena had warned me this was possible. "They'll say emotional instability. Impulsive behavior. Anything to undercut your legitimacy as her beneficiary." It didn't matter that June's will had been updated, notarized, and witnessed properly. Inheritance, like legacy, was rarely about what could be proven. It was about who could speak louder. So I stayed quiet. And I planned. I spoke with a legal advisor Lena recommended, a woman named Corinne, whose small office smelled of eucalyptus and paper. She wore no makeup, but her voice had the kind of calm that silenced storms. She said, "They'll try to prove neglect of intent. That you misunderstood June's wishes." I replied, "I didn't." She nodded. "Good. Then let's make sure they can't rewrite them." She helped me file a formal response. We compiled receipts, documents, correspondence. Corinne even drafted a protective motion, to ensure that no items could be removed from the nonprofit facilities without full judicial review. I left her office with the paperwork tucked close to my chest. On the train home, I watched the city pass in blurred streaks of gray and gold. And I realized something. They weren't fighting for June's memory. They were fighting for what they could take from it. That evening, I received another message, this one not from a lawyer, or family, or even Evan. It was from someone I didn't know. A woman named Edith Norin. She wrote, "I was a friend of June's, long ago. She told me if anything happened, I might hear from someone like you. I have a letter she asked me to hold. Call me." Her number was listed beneath it. I stared at the screen, heart still, breath shallow. Because if that was true, if June had reached beyond even this, then everything I'd done was only the beginning. I picked up the phone and dialed. Her voice was lower than I expected, rasped, like pages turned too many times. She answered on the second ring, no greeting, just my name spoken as if she'd been waiting for it. Edith said, "You sound just like her. Careful. Precise." I replied, "She said you had something for me." There was a pause, the kind that carries weight rather than hesitation. Then she gave me her address, a brownstone 2 towns over, and said to come before dusk. "I don't like visitors after dark," she added, like that explained everything. I arrived just after 4, coat buttoned tight, the cold wind pushing against my spine like a warning. Her home stood narrow and silent between 2 larger, renovated buildings. It looked untouched by time, like a place that remembered. She answered the door herself. Gray hair coiled low, eyes sharp. No smile. She led me through a hall lined with old portraits, none labeled, and into a small room that smelled faintly of cloves and dust. There was no fire, only a thin shawl draped across her shoulders like armor. From a drawer in a side table, she pulled out a faded envelope, the edges yellowed and sealed with brittle wax. "She told me to give it to you if they came for the truth," Edith said, placing it in my hands. I didn't open it right away. I waited until I got home, until the house was still and the door locked behind me. The paper inside was thin, the ink faded, but June's handwriting was unmistakable. "Eleanor. If you are reading this, then I was right to be cautious. There are stories buried under the floorboards of this family, and not all of them are mine to tell. But the ones I protected, the ones I carried, they belonged to women who had no voice in their time. This isn't just inheritance. It's stewardship. What they want to erase isn't about property. It's about memory." The ledger I hid behind the armoire, you'll find names, dates, transactions they hoped no one would notice. Some of the heirlooms were never ours to begin with. And if you find this, don't fight them loudly. Make them listen without raising your voice. They won't see it coming. J. I folded the letter and sat for a long time, staring at the small crack in the ceiling paint above me. The house was quiet. No voices. No footsteps. But I felt watched, not by someone malicious, but by time itself, waiting to see what I'd do next. I went to the armoire. Behind it, exactly as she said, was a slim wooden box nailed into the baseboard. I pried it open carefully. Inside was a leather-bound book, brittle but intact. The entries inside were meticulous. Sale records. Names. Items. Dates. Some matched what I'd already donated. Others didn't. There was one line that stopped me cold. 1938, sold under duress. MC2RW, pearl comb set, hand-etched, Provenance, Vienna. I'd seen that comb. I'd held it in my palm, admired the delicate engraving of laurel leaves. It had been in June's upstairs cabinet for as long as I could remember. I donated it to the museum with the note, "Family heirloom, c. 1900. But it wasn't ours. It had been taken. I scanned the rest of the page. There were others. At least 6 items marked confiscated, purchased below value, or simply unclaimed. My chest tightened. They weren't heirlooms. They were stolen histories. I reached out to Lena first. Told her I needed a quiet meeting, not at the office, not through email. We met at the Botanical Garden Cafe, a place so overgrown in winter that no one paid attention to anything except their own warmth. I laid the ledger on the table between us. She read in silence. Then said, "You understand what this means?" I nodded. She added, "If this gets out, your family's position is compromised. Not just in this dispute. Publicly. Historically." I sipped my tea, fingers steady. "I'm not interested in protecting their reputation," I said. She glanced up. "But it also puts you at risk. They'll double down if they know what you found." I looked past her to the frost-covered garden, where a single crow pecked at dead leaves. "I'm counting on it," I said. Because the only way to draw them into the open was to let them think I still had something to lose. I spent the next week preparing. I copied the ledger, 3 backups, stored in 3 different places. I contacted a legal scholar I trusted, someone from my museum days who specialized in cultural restitution. He was discreet. Ethical. He reviewed the documentation without asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. Then I returned to the storage unit. There were still boxes I hadn't opened since the first year after June died. In one, I found the museum catalog I'd made for her, a mock-up for her dream project, Women Who Held the Line. It was a proposal she never submitted. I'd forgotten it even existed. But her introduction leapt off the page. Preservation is not about perfection. It is about resistance, quiet, continual, necessary resistance to being forgotten. I scanned that page and attached it to an email addressed to Lena, Corinne, and the scholar. Just the title. Just the quote. No commentary. They would know what it meant. I didn't sleep the night before the mediation meeting. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again, tracing the crack with my eyes until it felt like a map. I thought about what it would be like to walk into that room, a room full of people who once knew me as a child, who now saw me as a threat. It didn't feel brave. It felt necessary. When I arrived at the law offices, the receptionist recognized my name without looking up. "Conference room C," she said, pointing down a narrow hall lined with framed degrees. I stepped inside, and they were already there, my mother, Martin, their attorneys, even Lydia in the corner, arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. Martin didn't greet me. He just said, "We hope this can be resolved amicably." I set my bag down gently, pulled out a folder, and placed it in front of Corinne. Then I looked at my mother. And I said, "So do I." She blinked. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for permission. I was offering a choice. Corinne opened the folder. And the silence that followed wasn't just legal. It was generational. And it was about to break. My mother's face didn't change immediately. She simply stared at the first page in Corinne's folder, her lips pressed into a flat, unreadable line. But Martin? He blinked twice, a flicker of disbelief shuddering across his carefully curated composure. I recognized it instantly. They'd expected outrage. Tears. Maybe even an emotional breakdown. What they hadn't expected was documentation. Corinne slid the folder across the table, 1 page at a time, narrating each with a measured cadence that sounded more like an autopsy than a legal defense. This ledger shows items in dispute were acquired under financial coercion. Here, 1938, a transaction noted as under duress involving the Cohen family, and here, 1942, a transfer documented as a post-eviction consignment. These are not simple family keepsakes. They carry provenance violations. My mother didn't look at Corinne. She looked at me. She said, "You brought this outside the family?" I replied, "You made it public the moment you hired Roswell and Klein." Martin leaned forward slightly, hands folded like he wanted to look reasonable. He said, "Eleanor, no one's accusing you of malice. But you're in over your head. These items belong with us. They were part of your grandmother's estate, regardless of what she believed about their origin." Corinne said, "They were transferred through a legally binding donation. The receiving institutions have filed their own protective notices. Reversing those now would require proof of fraudulent conveyance, which you don't have." Lena had offered to be there. I told her no. Her absence was strategic. Her silence would make her statements later more impactful. The institutions she represented weren't just backing me, they were preparing their own countersuits if the family pursued further action. I didn't want it to come to that. But I'd learned a long time ago, wanting peace doesn't mean tolerating the cost of silence. My mother finally spoke again. Her voice brittle. "You've humiliated us. Do you even realize what you've done? I answered, I made sure June's legacy isn't rewritten. The lawyer from Roswell and Klein shifted in his seat. He said, even if that's true, Ms. Whitmore, there's the matter of intent. The family's claim is that your donation was retaliatory. Emotionally driven. That you weren't in a fit state to make long-term decisions at the time. Corinne didn't flinch. She said, we have documented communications with multiple parties at the time of donation, each showing deliberation, inventory control, and fiduciary consistency. Emotional distress doesn't erase clarity. He turned to me then, tone suddenly softer. He said, do you really want this to escalate? I replied, that's not up to me anymore. My mother's eyes narrowed. I could see her calculating. Not emotion, but optics. Damage control. Lydia hadn't spoken, but her silence felt loud now. She stared at the table, her thumb moving slowly over the edge of a document she hadn't read. I wondered if she even knew what she was doing there. Martin broke the silence. He said, fine. If you won't return them, we'll take it to probate. Publicly. Every email, every transaction, every account, opened. Corinne didn't look up from her notes. She said, then you'll be introducing disputed wartime property into public record. Including items with unverifiable acquisition history. That's a risk you're comfortable with? Silence again. Only this time, it lingered. They hadn't expected we'd be ready to go that far. Because they'd never believed I'd do more than defend myself. What they didn't know, what June had always understood, was that preservation and revenge often wear the same gloves. My mother pushed her chair back slowly, the scrape of it too loud in the small room. She stood. She said, you've burned the bridge, Eleanor. I looked at her evenly. I said, it was never mine to walk across. She walked out without waiting for Martin. Her coat swung hard over her shoulder, like she needed the fabric to slam a door that wasn't there. Corinne gathered the papers quietly, her movements precise. Martin remained seated for a moment, then said, more quietly than before, this isn't over. I replied, it is for me. He left too. Only Lydia stayed. She looked up, finally meeting my eyes. I didn't know about the ledger, she said. I nodded. I know. She hesitated. Then, they'll twist this. Say you fabricated. That you manipulated June at the end. I met her gaze. They already did. She said nothing for a long moment. Then stood. I don't agree with them, she said, and her voice caught just slightly. But I'm not going to fight them either. I know, I said again. This time, it didn't sting. Because I no longer expected loyalty from people who measured relationships in degrees of convenience. When the room emptied, Corinne handed me the signed statements. This will hold, she said. But I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I walked home instead of taking the train, my boots crunching through thin layers of leftover sleet. The wind carried sharp edges through the narrow streets, slicing through the collar of my coat. But the cold felt clean. Real. When I reached my apartment, there was another letter under the door. No return address. Inside was a single page. Typed. Ms. Whitmore. We are in receipt of your recent submission concerning the disputed property. The museum is willing to open a conversation regarding full provenance display and potential restitution acknowledgement, should that be your intent. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. Dr. Miriam Cohen-Jameson, Deputy Director. I stood there holding it, barely breathing. Cohen. The name from the ledger. From the comb. It hadn't been lost. It had simply been waiting. And now, I had a new decision to make. I sat with the letter on my lap for over an hour before I moved. The museum's offer was clear. They weren't asking for scandal, not demanding reversal or silence. They were offering context. A place for the truth to breathe, not hidden in boxes or family disputes, but acknowledged, documented, displayed. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside June's ledger on my desk. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because I was finally free to make a decision without looking over my shoulder. I emailed Dr. Cohen Jameson the next morning. Briefly. Formally. I offered to meet. Not as a claimant or a donor, but as a granddaughter, of June, of Mabel, of every woman whose story had been swallowed by someone else's. The museum responded within hours. They'd like to host the conversation on-site, in the reference library. I arrived early. The walk through the exhibit hall felt surreal. I passed a glass case containing a shawl I'd donated, ivory lace with a faint floral stitch. The plaque now read, mid-century textile with contested lineage. Donated by Eleanor Whitmore. Accompanied by notes referencing displaced families, 1930s-40s. It had already begun. Acknowledgement was no longer a question. I met Dr. Cohen Jameson in a quiet, light-filled room with windows overlooking the park. She was calm. Professional. But I could see it in her eyes, she knew what this cost. Not just in logistics, but in blood. She asked only one question to start, do you want their names on the record? And I said, yes. Because justice without names is just paperwork. We spent the next hour going through the ledger together. She had a laptop open, typing notes with the kind of precision I appreciated more than I could say. I didn't need sentiment. I needed stewardship. When we reached the page with the Cohen entry, she paused. She said, there are descendants still living in Vienna. Would you consider contacting them? I didn't answer right away. Then I nodded. If they want it back, it's theirs. She looked at me, carefully. That won't be easy. I replied, neither was finding it. We drafted a joint statement, one that would be included with the upcoming exhibit, a rotating display of artifacts with full provenance histories, including gaps and contested ownership. I signed the agreement without hesitation. As I left the museum, I realized the cold felt different that day. It wasn't biting. It was brisk. Like air that moved instead of pressing down. When I got home, Corinne called. Her voice held that rare note of satisfaction lawyers rarely let themselves show. She said, they're backing off. No probate filing. No appeal. I didn't ask how she knew. I trusted her enough not to need the details. Instead, I said, thank you. For everything. She replied, you did the hard part. I set my phone down and stood in the center of my apartment. For the first time in months, maybe longer, the silence didn't feel loaded. It felt earned. Lena dropped by that weekend with a small box wrapped in linen. She placed it on my kitchen table like an offering. I thought you'd want this, she said. It's from the original inventory, one of the pieces you kept. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a pressed flower, preserved between glass panels in an antique frame. I remembered it now, June's pressed iris from her garden, the one she kept on her windowsill through every season. There was a note taped to the back. In case they forget what beauty looks like. I hung it by my bed that night. It was easy to believe, for a moment, that everything was over. That peace had finally settled in the wake of what we'd endured. But peace, I was learning, is not a finish line. It's a choice. One that must be made again and again, every time the past tries to rewrite itself. The next letter came quietly. Tucked in a plain envelope, slid through my door without postage. The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother. It contained only a few lines. No apology. No retraction. But your grandmother would be proud of you. And I suppose that's what matters now. No signature. No return address. But it was the closest thing to grace she would ever offer. I didn't write back. Instead, I took the letter and slipped it into the back of the ledger, not to preserve it, but to contain it. Let it sit among the facts. The record. The place where everything has to coexist, whether or not it was ever acknowledged aloud. Later that week, I visited June's grave for the first time since the mediation. The headstone was simple. Just her name, birth and death, and the inscription she'd chosen herself, she remembered. I sat beside it for a long while. No words. Just the wind, the scent of frozen soil, and the faintest rustle of dry leaves against marble. When I finally rose to leave, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the iris frame. I pressed it lightly against the stone, just for a moment. Then I whispered, "I did what you asked." And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was speaking to someone gone. I felt like I was reporting in. That evening, just before I turned off the lamp, I received an email from Dr. Cohen Jameson. The museum had made contact with the descendants of Miriam Cohen. They wanted to speak with me. Privately. Not to reclaim. But to thank me. And to tell me what that comb had once meant. I didn't expect the voice on the other end to sound so young. Or maybe it only felt that way because I'd grown old with the burden they were just now inheriting. When she said her name, Leah Cohen, I closed my eyes, letting the lineage settle into something more than paper. She spoke with the kind of quiet care that people use when touching broken things. And I listened. She said the comb belonged to her great-aunt, Miriam's younger sister. It had been passed down like a whisper, until war tore the family apart. No one knew what became of it. They thought it was gone, like so much else. I told her how I found it. Where it sat. How June had cared for it. Preserved it. Not just as an object, but as memory. As witness. She cried, softly, and then said the one thing I didn't know I needed to hear. She said, "You gave it back to history. Not to them, not to a family name or claim. But to history." I hung up the phone and sat in the fading light, letting her words settle into the hollow spaces left by everything I'd lost. I thought about how many things women carry, stories, scars, obligations, not because they want to, but because no one else will. June had known that. And she'd prepared me for it without ever saying so aloud. I didn't keep the comb. I didn't need to. Its story would now be told properly, with names, dates, and all the honesty my family had tried to bury under marble and manners. Weeks passed. The frost melted from the windows. The light lingered longer in the afternoons. I returned to my restoration work slowly, a few projects at a time. Each object felt different in my hands now, not heavier, but more willing. As if they trusted me. Sometimes I caught myself tracing the edges of things, whispering their probable journeys under my breath. Where they'd lived. Who'd loved them. Who had tried to forget them. It was less about objects now, and more about what they'd survived. I still hadn't spoken to my mother. She didn't call again. But once, in the grocery store, I saw her across the produce aisle. She stood beside a row of oranges, lifting one gently, inspecting it with the same critical eye she used for everything. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and chose not to. Either way, I didn't approach her. We'd made our choices. Lydia sent a card in early spring. No note. Just a pressed violet and a photograph of June's garden, taken from the upstairs window. I held it for a long time before tucking it into the back of the ledger. She hadn't betrayed me. But she hadn't stood beside me either. I wasn't angry. Some people are meant to observe. Not intervene. The museum exhibit opened in May. It was understated, careful, deeply human. The comb sat in a central case, flanked by artifacts that told similar stories, items that crossed borders, survived bombings, outlived names. The plaque beneath it read. Comb circa 1890, etched pearl. Belonging to Eva Cohen. Lost 1938, recovered 2024. Donated in honor of June Whitmore and all women who remembered what others forgot. I stood in front of it for nearly an hour. Visitors moved around me, murmuring, pointing, pausing. But I didn't hear them. I heard only June. I imagined her standing behind me, arms folded gently, saying nothing. Because she wouldn't have needed to. I left the exhibit without fanfare. No speeches. No interviews. Just a quiet walk home through streets that now felt both heavier and more open. A week later, I received an envelope in the mail. Unmarked. Inside, a photo I'd never seen. It was June, mid-30s maybe, seated in the garden. Miriam stood beside her, arm draped over the chair. They were laughing. Not posed. Not polite. Real. On the back, a message in June's hand. They thought we were just caretakers. We were architects. I pressed the photo to my chest, closed my eyes. And finally, I cried. Not from grief. Not from anger. But from release. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was repair. The kind only women know how to do, in silence, in fragments, with hands that keep moving long after the applause has stopped. Summer came. I started sketching again. Not for work, but for myself. I drew pieces I remembered from June's house, the brass doorknob shaped like a tulip, the carved headboard with a nick from where she once dropped a candlestick, the cracked tea saucer she refused to throw out because it had seemed too much to be discarded now. I filled the pages slowly. Not to preserve. To honor. One morning, I opened the windows wide and let the wind scatter my notes across the floor. And I didn't gather them. Some stories don't need to be held anymore. They just need to be allowed to move. And mine, finally, was one of them.